In this video, we're going to get user input to create a new user parameter. Hey everyone, this is Matt with Learn Everything About Design, and in this video, we're going to take our API learning the next step. We've already learned some basics of Python. We've learned about getting information from a user parameter that already exists. We learned about creating a user parameter, and then we also learned about getting information or input from the user. What we want to do at this point is we want to explore how to take the user input and then use it to create a new parameter. Now, in the last video, we went through and we copied or we brought in some examples from the API helps, a sample program that we could use to get input from the user. We made a few adjustments. Now, that program had error checking and it had some if statements for if the user canceled the dialog, and those are all extremely important. But what we're going to do is we're going to shortcut that. We're going to create a new script. And the new script is not going to worry about error handling. Now, I do think it's extremely important that if you continue to play around with scripts and you continue to try to make them, that you learn more about error handling. But for our example, I want to try to streamline it. I know we've spent a lot of time up to this point, and I want to learn how we can just progress it a little bit further. So we're going to be taking these sort of baby steps. And at this point, we did get information about that user parameter. We created one, and then we got input. But now we're going to create one that allows the user to set that. So we're going to create, again, Python. And this one is going to be, again, API, so it just sits at the top of my list. And it's going to be user create UP, user create user parameter. I know, these are real original names. We're going to go into edit that. I'm going to bring it over to the screen, and we're going to trust the document. So again, I'm just going to stick with just using this default code. We're going to again start with design, and that's going to be equal to adsk.fusion.design.cast. And again, we're casting that to the app, which is our application, .active product. So once we create that, and again, it's important to note that app, UI, and design are not set in stone. You can make these whatever you want. It just makes sense for UI for the user interface, app for the application, and design for the design. Those just make the most logical sense. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're not going to worry about, again, the error handling. We want to get information from the user, and we're going to assume that they're going to enter something correct. So we're not going to spend the time to worry about the if statements or the error handling or whether or not it's valid. We're just going to assume it's valid and worry about the rest of it. So what we're going to do is we're going to set a default input, just like we did before. And I'm going to set that equal to 5 millimeters. So we're going to do the same thing, keeping in mind that that has to be a string. Because we're going to include the millimeters with the number, it has to be a string. Then we're going to create a new input. Again, the new input is going to be our UI.input box. And inside of there, we need to have our prompt. So what we're going to do in this case is we're going to ask the user to input the name of, in this case, the name of a user parameter. So enter a new user parameter name. We'll put a space in there, and remember that we have other things that we can do. So we're going to set a new title. So the title that's going to be at the top of that box is going to be new user parameter. And then from there, what we have is the default value. So we're going to use the default input value. Default input. So now what's happening again is the new input is a tuple. It's got a string and a Boolean that comes back. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change this new input. I'm going to change it to new input name. So new input name, and then we're going to do a new input number. So that's going to help us, sort of figure that out. Now, again, we could work with a true dialog in Fusion 360 and ask for multiple inputs at the same time. But again, we have to take small steps. So I'm going to call this one new input number. And this is going to be equal to UI.inputBox. And we're going to have them enter a user parameter value. And again, we are going to add a comment here, new user parameter. And then we need the default value, right? So before I set the default input as the default input, but we're going to have to fix that. So what we're going to do here is this is going to be the default input, because the default input is actually going to be the default input number. So I'm going to put number on there. So then I need to make sure that I don't mess up the formatting. Then I need to come back up here and turn this into default input number. Then the little squiggly line underneath it goes away. And then I need to create one that is the default input name. And I don't necessarily need this. I could put the string directly in here. But again, it's good for us to sort of build these parameters. So default input name, and we're going to set this to diameter. And we'll just make sure that this is default input name, and then the error should go away. Now again, the squiggly underlines are telling us that we put a variable here that doesn't exist. When they turn white, that means we've used them. When they're gray, they still haven't been used anywhere. So at this point, nothing is happening in the script after we get the values from the user, but this is a great time for us to check it. So we're going to come back up and we're going to do user create UP. It's going to say enter a new parameter name, diameter, enter a new user parameter value, 5 millimeters, and then the UI message box is still in there. So again, we are going to assume that the user entered a proper value. We're not going to worry about if they hit cancel or if they did something else. We're just going to assume that they're competent and they entered a value. And again, we're not worried about error handling because I want to streamline this a little bit. So after we get the user input, I'm going to put some spaces in here just to clean up the code. So now that we have the input name and the input number, the name is fine because it's a string. We can use it directly, but the input number, we still want to send through and make sure that it's formatted properly in case they enter it in inches or centimeters or whatever. We want to format it back through. One thing we haven't done is we haven't used the units manager to get the default lengths. Now we could do that, or we could manually enter the value, the units that we want. So that's something that we could consider, and we'll go ahead and we'll take a look at that here. So now our new input number, what we're going to do is we're going to make our units MGR, and we're going to set that equal to design.unitsManager. Now we can use that. So we're going to take our real input number. Now remember, we're going to be taking the input from the user, the value, and that was a string. If it's 5 millimeters by default, or if they're going to change it, then what's going to end up happening is we're going to take that number and we're going to process it. We're going to use the units manager. So the real input number is going to be the units MGR, and we're going to use evaluate expression. And then we need to figure out what the expression is as a string, which is what we sent back. And that's going to be the, in this case, the new input number, but remember that's a tuple, so we need to put it in the brackets and say that it's the first item, that index number 0. And then for the units, instead of us putting millimeters in there, what we're going to do is we're going to use the units MGR again, and we're going to say dot default length units. So the default length units, it's going to grab whatever the units are set in the Fusion 360 design. It's going to capture that information. Now we could, again, use millimeters, we could use inches, whatever we want, but this at least takes account of what's in there from the user. So now we have our real input number and we have our new input name. The new input name is a string. The real input number, if we take a look at this, is a float, and we still need to process that so that we can use it when we're trying to create our new user parameter. So at this stage, the next step is for us to process this, and we can process this by, again, doing create by real. So we're gonna have to figure out yet another value or another variable that we want to use, unless we decide to try to reset one. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take this converted or this processed number, this real input number, and we need to take that and turn it into the value input. So I'm going to call this one the real value input. And this real value input is going to be equal to our adsk.core.value input. So this value input is what we used before, and then create by real. With the create by real, then what we're going to do is we're going to put a real value in there. Now, remember, theoretically, that real value is a float, and our real input number is a float. So what we're going to do is do real input number, and theoretically, that should work. And now what we've done is we've asked the user for a string. They've given us back a string, a name. And remember, we still need to be mindful of that is a tuple, so we need to have it in that 0 position. Then we got a number back. We created the units manager variable. Then we used this real input number. We took that first position string from the tuple, and we used the default length units, which in most cases is metric, and we evaluated that expression. Now we created this real value input by pushing it through the create by real, and this is the value that Fusion 360 theoretically wants to see when we try to push this through to a user parameter. At this point, now we want to create our new user parameter. So that, if you remember, is design dot user parameters, and then we're going to do dot add. Now remember, as soon as we start the brackets, it's going to tell us exactly what it's looking for. So the first thing it's looking for is the name, and that was our new input name. But remember, it's a tuple, so position 0. Then what we're going to do is comma. Now it's looking for the value input. This should be our real value input. The next thing that it's looking for is the units. Now we already know that the units of our document, our default units, are metric. I'm not sure if you can leave this one blank, but what we're going to do is we're going to use the units manager. Now the object that we created, that variable we created, dot, and we're going to use the default length units. So that theoretically should fill in the default units. And the last thing that we need is the comment. And if we don't want to use a comment, we could just use empty brackets. And it's going to return a user parameter, but we don't actually need that return. So this should theoretically work. We don't really need the UI message box in here, so I'm just going to put a comment in front of it, and I'm going to save this. So if we did everything right, then we should be able to run this. Now, we should keep in mind that we do still have parameters. If you still have the same document open, you have length and width already. So if we run this, we need to be careful that we don't try to replace that. So user created UP, we're going to run it. I'm going to leave diameter as the default value. I am going to change this to 500 and say OK. Now let's go ahead and check our user parameters. Diameter, 500 millimeters. So the conversion works. The value is created. Let's go ahead and create another one. So let's try this again. Add-ins, user created UP. This time I'm going to call this one height. We're going to say, okay, remember we haven't done any error handling. If we hit cancel, it's not going to be pretty. So we're going to hit OK. And then instead of 5 millimeters, I'm going to say 25 inches. We're going to see if the unit conversion and all that stuff works. We're going to say OK. Obviously, we don't have a dialog box that pops up. If we go back here, we can go to change parameters. Now we have height, and it's in metric. It's 635 millimeters. Now, remember we entered 25 inches. So if we multiply that by 25.4, we get 635. So the conversion is working. Everything is working fine. There's one last thing that we might want to do, and I'm going to go back into the program, and I'm probably going to leave the UI message box. And even though we don't actually have error handling, we can put success in there, so that way the user knows that something actually happened. So keeping in mind that so far we didn't deal with any sort of degrees, right? It automatically came in as radians in the back end. We didn't even touch degrees. We've only been looking at length. So what's going to happen if we try to create something called draft? And instead of 5 millimeters, let's say that I put 5 DEG for degrees and say, okay, I get an issue. And part of the reason that we get an issue is because we don't pass a valid expression. So if we try to go back and look at our user parameters, the value for our draft didn't come in. And again, that's because we've been looking at ways in which we can code, and we brought in things like the default length units. So this units is optional for the evaluate expression. If we took the units out, then the evaluate expression isn't going to work quite the same, but it still will check to make sure that it is a valid input. So if we took this out, and what I want to do to test this is I'm going to copy this line, I'm going to put it just below it, and then I'm going to comment this one out. And the reason I'm going to do that is I want to take out this second part, this optional argument of the unit, and then down here for the default units, I am going to just put empty quotes, and I'm going to see if that will work. I'm not sure if that'll work or not, but I'm going to save it and I'm going to try. If this doesn't work, then we would have to do a little bit more digging to deal with using the variables for radians and degrees. But let's just see if this works, see if we can trick it. So I'm going to call this one draft. And again, I'm going to do 5 DEG for degrees, and we still get an error. So again, some more work is going to be needed to make that section work, but for the most part, you can see that it is working pretty well. So I'm going to use the units mgr dot default length units, and then over here, that was our comment, and up here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring back the one that deals with the default length units, then I'm going to delete this one. So at this point, again, these videos have been kind of a little bit longer than I was hoping, but now what we've created so far actually has some decent functionality. We can go in and we can create a user parameter based on its name, and that's a string. It passes directly as a string, so we can have numbers, but it's just going to be added as a string. And then here is a value, and this value can have centimeters, inches, any default units. If we type in inch completely, Fusion 360, as long as it understands that, then it will be able to carry that over. But the nuance to that is we are using some code that is specifically looking at default length units. And the reason that's important is because if we create our own, the length units are only the ones that are inside of this length dropdown. The angle units are the ones for radians, degrees, and grad. So we don't have things like degrees, minutes, seconds, but we do have degrees. So looking through the code, we would have to figure out, if we're going to ask for an angle value, how do we handle that? So the default length units, if I try to type in units manager dot default, you notice that only length units comes in. And if I look through everything else, we'd have to potentially use internal units or format units and so on. But again, a little bit more work is going to have to be done in order to figure that aspect out. I think this is a great place to stop. I think we've got some good functionality. And in the next video, I do plan to carry this on a little bit more. We will talk more about topics that surround the user input and these units and so on. But I don't think that this video series is going to go much further. I've already sort of achieved what I had set out to achieve. I just want to make sure that if there are any additional questions, that I do my best to try to answer them. So at this point, if there are any questions, if there's something that you are trying to figure out, again, full disclaimer, I am not a programmer, so I can only do so much. But if there's anything else that you're trying to do with this and you're struggling, I'm more than happy to try to help figure it out. I'm not sure that I'm the best person for that, but I will do my best to try to answer questions and maybe point you in the right direction. But at this stage, we've done quite a bit. We've learned the basics of Python in general, and specifically creating variables, talking about classes, and methods or functions, the way that we can use those. We've learned the basics of creating a very simple API program where we're looking at pulling a parameter from Fusion 360. We learned how to create a parameter. We learned how to get input from a user. We also learned how to use the units manager to evaluate that. And then we also know how to take that input from the user, convert it in a way that makes sense for the user parameters so we can add a new one. A little bit left to do on that to deal with angles and potentially a better user interface, but right now I'm happy with the results. So at this stage, if you have any comments, please leave them in the video. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.